So I'm very, very happy to welcome our first keynote speaker, Artemi-Maria Gioti. So I'm sure she'll be known to many people in this room, not least because you've hopefully read the abstract on the website, but also because Artemi is a kind of composer and researcher who's very much connected to lots of the things we think about at CHIME and in the kind of surrounding discourse. So as a composer and researcher, a lecturer in new media and digital technologies for music at the University of Music Carl Maria von Weber, Dresden, and as many of you will know, a research fellow at UCL in London. And her work has engaged really deeply with different kinds of applications of machine learning, machine listening, and trying to find ways of kind of exploring these processes and the materiality of that process in the compositional work. So I think it's going to be a really fun place to start today. Thank you, Artemi.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the presentations and discussions ahead. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So the title of my talk today is Listening Through Machine Learning Algorithms and Data. And that through is a reference to Christensen and Cheney's claim that representations are constitutive of the referent, that they are as much ways of looking into as they are ways of looking through. So the topic of this talk is the mediative nature of machine learning algorithms and data. I will be investigating this topic from an artistic or practice-based research perspective. I am a composer and artistic researcher doing critical research on music and AI, and my research generally consists in autoethnographies of the compositional process, which are aimed at investigating the impact of technology on artistic practice, compositional practice in particular, but also producing critical insights into technology. So in this talk, I will explore this second bullet point there. How can practice-based research in composition produce critical insights into machine learning algorithms and data practices? The research I will describe today was carried out in the context of the MAS-AI project, the full title of which is Music and Artificial Intelligence Building Critical Interdisciplinary Studies. The MAS-AI program is a 5-year research program funded by the European Research Council and led by Georgina Born at UCL. And specifically, the work I will describe today was carried out in the context of a smaller work package within the MAS-AI project, which has a practice-based research focus. Aaron Einbond and I are both involved in this work package. So this is the musical work that I will focus on today. It's called Bias 2, and it's a piece for piano and interactive music system. On the screen, you see the main page from the score of this piece, which, as you can see, consists of some groups, some clusters of musical actions grouped together based on their timbral similarity as I perceive it. These musical actions involve extended playing techniques and primarily inside piano playing techniques, as well as various preparations, some of which are visible in this photo. Maybe this is a good point to play some sound examples from cluster 1. Cluster 3. Cluster 4. And 6. So yeah, this is just to give you an idea. The piece has an open form, so this means that the pianist can transition freely between any of these clusters. And a recurrent neural network, or RNN, tries to learn how performers do that, how they transition between these different types of sound material. So during performances of the work, this RNN predicts and proposes possible trajectories for the continuation of the performance based on what it has learned from past performances of the piece. This is what the data used to train this RNN look like. This sequence of numbers here represents an entire performance of the piece by pianist Magda Mayas, recorded in September 2022 in Berlin. So each number in this sequence corresponds to 1 second of audio and represents the predominant timbre or cluster during that particular second. So we can see that in this particular run-through, Magda seems to have started with sound material from cluster 4. Then she seems to have briefly transitioned to cluster 7. And then apparently she played nothing for 3 seconds. These logs of individual performances of the work are actually generated by another machine learning algorithm performing a timbre classification task. So this algorithm simply assigns sounds played by the musician to one of the 7 clusters in the score. And this machine listening algorithm actually has 2 functions in this work. The first is obviously to generate logs of individual performances, which can later be used to train the RNN. But its second function is to match different timbres to different digital signal processing techniques. So different transformations are applied to the piano signal based on the currently recognized timbre. So these logs of past performances of the work are used as training data for the RNN, which of course learns to generate similar sequences of numbers by predicting one number at a time, just like you see here. In fact, this process has been sped up here, and in reality, the RNN only makes 1 prediction per second. So each second of the performance, the RNN looks at what came before and predicts how the performance is likely to continue, what cluster is likely to follow next. If this prediction differs from the musician's actions in that moment, then the computer music system responds by playing back a pre-recorded sample of the cluster predicted by the RNN. Crucially, before its new performance of this piece, the RNN is trained on all of its past performances. So the pianist in this piece is set in dialogue with the work's interpretative history, with interpretative choices made by themselves but also others in the past. So one of the main themes explored in Bias 2 is distributed and collaborative creativity. And creativity in this work is distributed both among actors, human and non-human, but it's also dispersed in time and space. Another theme explored in this piece is the ontology of the musical work. So due to the fact that processes of datafication and learning in this work extend beyond a single performance, Bias 2 could be described as what Georgina Bourne terms a provisional musical work, which, quote, both retains and blurs the traces and boundaries of individual and collective authorship. Another theme explored in this piece are critical insights into machine learning gained through practice-based research in composition. And one such critical insight concerns data materiality and data semiotics. I have written on these topics in an article co-authored with Aaron Einbond and Georgina Bourne, and recently published in the Computer Music Journal. And in this article, Aaron and I discussed the work that we have done in the context of the Mass AI project, and which draw on a different theoretical framework relevant to our own artistic practice. So for Aaron, this theoretical framework is material engagement, and for me, it is critical data studies. So in this article, I present an autoethnography of the data-making processes involved in creating Bias 2. In this autoethnography, I trace the impact that the specific microphones and even the specific music information retrieval tools used in the data-making process had on the machine listening algorithm used in the piece, this timbre classification algorithm. For instance, among other things, I detail how training this neural network on data that had been collected using a single microphone resulted in a machine learning model that could only make accurate predictions when used in combination with that exact same microphone. I also trace the impact that various decisions made throughout the data-making process had on the machine listening algorithm. One such decision, for example, was the decision to only include recordings of one action at a time or one timbre at a time in the data set, which of course means that the machine listening algorithm is unable to make accurate predictions when musicians actually superimpose sound material from more than one clusters during the performance. This autoethnography of data-making processes is essentially aimed at denaturalizing data, challenging common understandings of data as natural, neutral, collectible, context-independent, a priori entities, and instead drawing attention towards their material, processual, but also relational properties. So, as Annette Markham observes, quote, the term data is in most common usage associated with something that one gathers, hence is a priori and collectible. Data are potentially informational, yes, but those operationalized in most of the social or natural sciences function fundamentally as discrete objects that can be located in time and space. The problem with this conceptualization is that it remains categorically different from, and in a sense opposed to, the very idea of process. In the same article, I draw on data semiotics and specifically Lindsay Poirier's denotative, connotative, and deconstructive readings of data sets in order to unveil the aesthetic decisions embedded in the data used to train the RNN in this work. A denotative reading focuses on the literal meaning of the values, what the numbers stand for. A connotative reading aims to situate data sets within certain historical context. And a deconstructive reading examines what is left out of the data or what is rendered invisible through processes of datafication. So returning back to my earlier example, I would like to perform a connotative and deconstructive reading of this data, focusing on the aesthetic values rather than the politics enmeshed in this data, as Poirier suggests. I already mentioned in my denotative reading of this data that the numbers we see here represent clusters of musical actions grouped together based on their timbral similarity. So given that what is represented by this sequence of numbers as a whole is in fact musical form, this suggests an understanding of form as a function of timbre, or a prioritization of timbre as an articulator of musical form. This information immediately places the work within certain music historical and aesthetic contexts. For instance, the tradition of the prepared piano, but also timbre-based as opposed to pitch-based approaches to music composition in general. The quantization of the data here is also suggestive of the crystallization of aesthetic values in the data. I mentioned earlier that for each second of audio, only the predominant timbre or cluster during that second gets recorded in the data. And this was effectively a compositional decision. This was a purely aesthetic decision meant to impose a constraint on musical form. So this effectively limits the maximum frequency of musical changes that can be proposed by the computer music system to 1 per second. The fact that these data were generated by another machine learning algorithm performing a machine listening task takes on additional meaning in the context of this connotative reading, because it suggests that this process of datafication of individual performances of the work is subject to error. And indeed, the machine listening algorithm used in this piece makes many mistakes. And these mistakes feed into what the RNN learns and predicts, causing it to forge false associations between different timbres. And this has led to some extremely interesting, unpredictable, and emergent behaviors. Indeed, in certain cases, the computer music system is not mirroring the performer's interpretive choices as much as it is amplifying its own listening process. Finally, crystallized in this data are the performer's interpretative choices, which suggests a destabilization of the composition performance binary. Its performance of this piece is at the same time an act of co-authorship. Its performance of this work both instantiates and rewrites the work. And indeed, performances of this piece by Magda Myers, Xenia Pestova-Bennett, and more recently David Palmer, as crystallized in the form of data and as mediated through processes of datafication, are an integral part of this composition. Finally, shifting perspectives from a connotative to a deconstructive reading unveils processes of demarcation in data making. I mentioned earlier that the emphasis here lies on timbre. This is a timbre-based approach to music composition, which of course leaves out a large number of alternative perspectives and framings, for instance, pitch, but also rhythm and duration, articulation, phrasing, dynamics, and so on. Also left out is spectral information, rendered redundant by the particular music information retrieval tools used here, as well as through the majority vote involved in this quantization process that I described earlier. And finally, on last process of demarcation here concerns the isolation of the oral from the visual and the embodied experience of the performance. So rendered redundant through this emphasis on machine listening are the choreography of the performer's movements, the material conditions of sound production, for instance, the various objects that the performer uses to perform extended playing techniques, and many other inaudible aspects of the performer's interaction with the computer music system. For instance, moments in which the performer visibly changes their mind about what to do next after a musical change has just been introduced by the computer music system. The topics I've discussed so far, data materiality and data semiotics, are all addressed in the article I mentioned earlier, and you're welcome to read it. It's an open access article, so you can read it online or download the PDF for free. But for the second part of this talk, I actually wanted to focus on some work in progress, things I'm currently thinking about, things I'm currently writing about. So I mentioned earlier that the machine listening algorithm used in this piece makes mistakes, and these mistakes are consequential for the behavior of the computer music system. So recently I decided to examine these mistakes more closely in order to understand the work that they do in this piece. And I came up with this idea during a rehearsal for a performance of this piece with David Palmer in London. So what I would like to do next is read an excerpt from my autoethnographic notes on this rehearsal. Okay, here we go. So Sunday, September 8th, 2024. In preparation for a performance of Bias 2 the following day at the International Conference on AI Music Creativity in Oxford, pianist David Palmer and I meet in London for a rehearsal and data collection session. After setup and a brief demonstration of some of the playing techniques used in the piece, we move on to the main task of the session, recording examples of David's interpretations of the work, which will later be added to the training set used to train the RNN ahead of the performance. After a quick sound check, we start with the first data collection round. A few minutes into this round, I observe that the machine listening algorithm is behaving unusually. Not only is it making more frequent mistakes than usual, but perhaps more interestingly, it is making different mistakes. I pause and ask what might be contributing to this behavior. Is it the piano, the acoustics of the studio, or the audio equipment? Even though each instrument is slightly different, the piece has been performed on pianos of the same model several times in the past without this behavior ever occurring. Similarly, the microphone and audio interface used are exactly the same as in all previous rehearsals and performances of the work. The acoustic environment is equally unlikely to be the cause of this behavior, as the type of microphone used, contact, means that any leaking of background noise into the signal should be negligible, which makes these discrepancies all the more puzzling. Could this be a faulty cable? As I'm analyzing the complex human technical assemblage involved in transfiguring the piano sound into numerical inputs interpretable by the neural network, I distinctly remember having put more adhesive than usual on the contact microphone before attaching it to the soundboard. Not having any better explanation as to why the system is exhibiting this behavior, I decide to remove some of the adhesive and see whether this has an impact on the machine listening algorithm. Indeed, this seems to immediately restore the machine listening algorithm back to its default state, or at least a state more consistent with its past behavior. With this issue now resolved, I decide to discard the data collected during this first round and start over with the data collection process. Later on during that rehearsal, I often caught myself attempting a speculative error analysis of the machine listening algorithm's predictions. So I decided to do that a bit more consistently at a later point by running a recording of one of David's interpretations of the work repeatedly through the machine listening algorithm and pausing as needed. So I would just like to read two more excerpts from this error analysis. Here's the first one. David starts the run-through with repeated variations of an action from cluster 2, rubbing a Super Bowl mallet along the wooden and metal frame of the piano. He's playing brief, articulated gestures, varying in pitch from low to mid-range and creating irregular rhythmic patterns. The machine listening algorithm accurately recognizes the cluster most of the time, but occasionally changes its prediction to clusters 5 and 6. Specifically, when the pitch gets higher, the algorithm seems to change its prediction from 2 to 5, a cluster that contains musical actions making use of an EBO. This immediately unveils a misalignment between David's and my interpretation of the Super Bowl action as reflected in the training data. Examples of cluster 2 in the training set are longer, lower pitched, and less articulated than David's interpretation of the action. Pitch in particular seems to be a determining factor here, as higher pitched gestures seem to immediately trigger a change in the algorithm's prediction from 2 to 5. The algorithm seems to have associated this higher pitch range with cluster 5, likely because, due to a variety of technical reasons, the use of the EBO in this piece is limited to a specific pitch range. At other times, the resonance of individual gestures seems to be accompanied with a rattling sound, presumably some of the preparations inside the piano being brought into vibration. This seems to cause the algorithm to change its prediction from 2 to 6, a cluster that is associated with noisy, unpitched sounds such as scratching and scraping. I believe we heard some examples from cluster 6 earlier on in this presentation. And here is another excerpt from this analysis. 2 minutes into the run-through, David transitions to another action from cluster 3, which involves plucking mid-range strings at the base of the tuning pegs. This creates a pointillistic texture of dry metallic sounds, which is soon brought in counterpoint with a sequence of strokes on the piano frame using a wooden mallet. So this would be cluster 7. We have cluster 3 and cluster 7 at the same time. For the most part, the algorithm is able to follow the transitions between these two clusters, but seems confused by the superimposition of the two, which causes it to predict an entirely different cluster. Yet another misalignment between the current audio input and the training data is revealed here. The algorithm has been trained on analyzed recordings of one musical action at a time, and therefore superimpositions of more than one clusters are not represented in the dataset. I promise I won't read anymore. So here is a summary of the key insights into the machine listening algorithm yielded by this analysis. Firstly, the machine listening algorithm seems to be listening through entangled materialities. So pianos, audio interfaces, cables, microphones, and even microphone adhesives are constitutive of the data that the machine listening algorithm operates on, and therefore of its predictions. Secondly, the machine listening algorithm seems to be learning by analogy. So rather than generalizing from the training data on new unseen data, which is the promise of machine learning, the algorithm really seems to unveil all these misalignments between all the new data. And rather than inducing some general, abstract, and universal principles, it seems to be highlighting the local, concrete, and specific. And this, of course, highlights an interesting and inherent tension between small data artistic approaches and the data-hungry nature of machine learning algorithms, the reliance of machine learning algorithms on big data. Thirdly, the machine listening algorithm seems to be obscuring ambiguity and complexity. Examples that do not fit into any of the categories, such as superimpositions of more than one clusters, are made to fit into these categories, resulting in predictions that are either partially correct, for instance, when the algorithm only recognizes the loudest cluster, or in predictions that are completely incorrect. And finally, the machine listening algorithm seems to be learning or discovering some unintended patterns in the data. So while the musical actions in the score are grouped together based on their timbre similarity, and indeed it is timbre that I am interested in, the machine listening algorithm seems to have learned some associations that are related to pitch rather than timbre. I'm almost out of time, so before we move on to the Q&A session, I would like to play a very brief excerpt from the premiere of this piece by Magda Mayes at CHIME in Karlsruhe, Germany. So here it is. you. Yeah, I believe we have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks so much, Asmi. That's great. The full video of Bias 2 is on Artemi's website. If anyone wants to see the whole, that's right?
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah. Great. So we have about 10 minutes of questions if people have things they want to ask following that.
Thank you. You mentioned that the predictive algorithm that tries to predict which cluster is going to be played next or currently plays an excerpt of the cluster that it predicted when the prediction was wrong. And am I understanding correct in that? Correct in understanding that?
So it plays a pre-recorded sample of the predicted cluster if it differs from the musician's.
Exactly. So that seems to me like it almost puts an explicit focus on the notion of the mistakes in the prediction. And so the more correct in predicting the cluster the algorithm is, the more silent it is. It doesn't actually contribute all that much. Was that intended?
Yes, but I think I'm conceptualizing it slightly different because the piece really questions the notion of generalizability. So the idea that there is something to be learned from past performances of the work and applied to the next. So that it's a very ironic take on prediction in that sense. Because I do not know that there is something to be learned from, for example, one performer and extrapolated to the next, or even the same performer makes different choices and decisions in two different instantiations of the work. So the way I perceive this is, the algorithm makes a prediction and plays back a pre-recorded sample of that prediction as a suggestion to the performer. So I'm not really conceptualizing in the sense of right or wrong mistakes or correct predictions. It's just a suggestion, that the performer could go in that direction. I don't know if that, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
but
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Artemi. Nice presentation. I was interested in your research approach, autoethnography and personal diaries throughout extended periods of time, characterizing the behavior of the machine learning. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on one of your key insights, which is listens through entangled materialities, and how, for instance, the data semiotics actually inform that insight.
Yeah, so starting with materiality, I think I didn't go into great detail here, but I do in the article. So, I mentioned in the article the mediative agency of microphones is always very surprising when working with machine listening algorithms. So yeah, after training this machine listening algorithm on data that I had recorded using one microphone, obviously, I had created a model that only worked with that particular microphone. And of course, this is very common, overfitting is very common with machine learning algorithms, and the kind of solutionist approach to this is you go and collect more data using many different microphones and pianos, which I did. So I think by the end, I trained this algorithm with several hours of material being collected with, I think it was 6 or 7 microphones and 3 different pianos and so on. What I also found interesting is this, the mediative nature of music information retrieval tools. So in this particular case, I am using MFCCs, mel frequency cepstral coefficients. And I did do an interesting experiment in the context of the compositional process where I used the analyzed training examples for the machine listening algorithm, but instead of using them to train a classification algorithm, I fed them into a clustering algorithm and asked it to cluster the sounds into 7 clusters, which is the number I use in the score. And it was extremely interesting to see how much the clusters produced by the algorithm, by the clustering algorithm, deviated from my own clusters in the score. So this is also quite interesting because we can't really think of music information retrieval tools as neutral. They are powerful mediators. And this, what I mentioned regarding PITs in the end of my presentation was very evident here, that the algorithm would really learn associations based on PITs, you know. So this kind of distinction between PITs and timbre as categories, which we make quite often in Western music, seems to collapse, obviously, when sound is translated into spectrum, timbre, and descriptors. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just wondering as a follow-up, but if you'd consider like an army of Artemis, like 1 million Artemis, all doing the same approach that you're doing and collecting this huge data set,
Yeah.
do you think that the key insights, would they change from what you obtained here? Or
The key insights, I don't know what you mean.
or I mean, like all the information and knowledge that you've distilled in this process, would you think that would somehow be related to an instance of more local information? Like,
Okay. Well, you know, I only try to make claims from a very localized perspective. And here, for example, when I talk about the machine listening algorithm, perhaps I should have specified that. But, you know, what is the machine listening algorithm for me? This is not a neural network coded in Python. It is an assemblage, right? So this contains the microphone. It contains the piano. It contains the other things like the majority rule, this quantization process. All of it is part of the machine listening algorithm for me. And, of course, it also contains the data that it's been trained on. So, you know, I always try to make claims from kind of a very situated perspective. At the same time, I will say that these are things that have come up pretty consistently for me. And I've been doing this for several years now. So, yeah, I don't know. There are things that I come across, you know, again and again. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this absolutely fantastic talk. I also really enjoyed the aspects of embodiment and materiality as revealed through this process of not only the learning, but also the iterative process of performance. One question I had actually relates to the spectrum of similarity versus difference. So according to my understanding, this actually focuses more on similarity, not only on a local level between the MFCC signatures of the performed and the training data or the fixed media in the background used to train, but also similarities between different performances and the prediction of the next possible or the next segment. Have you experimented with actually maximizing difference to choose the exact opposite to see if you can get it as far away from that MFCC signature as possible, and then also that feedback loop of how that might influence the performer's decisions when confronted by material of maximal distance?
Maximal distance. Well, regarding the machine listening algorithm, I think there are materials in the clusters that are quite different, and that the machine listening algorithm seems to get very easily. And I really think it's more confused when clusters, not superimposed, when clusters overlap in terms of pitch, for example. So it's very good at getting these really big differences, but not so much when it comes to subtleties of the material. I will say I have experimented with maximizing differences in my selection of the performers who have performed this piece. Yeah. So there are people that come from very different backgrounds and who approach the piece very differently, and that has been extremely interesting. So I mentioned Magda. We saw her perform, and Magda Mayas is a composer and improviser who works a lot with inside piano playing techniques. So her approach to the piece was extremely interesting. She seemed to transition between different materials quite fast. And this kind of showed in what the RNN learned. So when I took the system trained on Magda's data and rehearsed with Ksenia Pestova-Bennett, who was the second performer who performed this piece, Ksenia, on the first day, Ksenia thought that the system is not listening at all, that they are not gelling, this is not working out. So it was very interesting. On that same day, we collected some of her interpretations of the work, and then I trained the RNN overnight. And the next day, she had a completely different impression of the system, and she thought that the system is listening more, it's responding more. I don't know that the system was listening more, but I do think that there were some key differences in their interpretations that the algorithm mirrored. And for me, the main difference was that, as I mentioned earlier, Magda seemed to transition between different types of material quite fast. And Ksenia seemed to stay in the same cluster for several minutes at a time and really exploring every nuance. So yeah, that was quite interesting. I would say that their performances were very, very different. And I want to see to what extent, or until when this approach will make sense and when it will stop making sense. Because I'm really interested in the relationship between the individual and the aggregate here. So each performer's individual interpretation of the piece versus the data set as aggregate. And maybe in a few years' time, I will decide that this no longer makes sense, and the average of 10 completely different performers is just, it's just something I can't really work with. So this is very much an ongoing experiment in that sense, and I want to see how this goes and whether that makes sense. And I'm also working with the performers, interviewing the performers I work with, so I'm planning to write an article on that as well at some point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, I'm afraid that's the last question we've got time for. Sorry about that, Mickey, but you can obviously ask afterwards. So let's thank Artemi for a